Okay, let's dive right into this. Today, we're unpacking a deeply complex and intensely debated geopolitical topic. We're looking closely at a May 2026 op-ed published in Dawn by Zahid Hussain, which centers on some very severe allegations regarding the treatment of Palestinian prisoners. Now, right off the bat, our goal with this explainer isn't to endorse a specific viewpoint, but to impartially map out exactly what the source material is arguing. We want to understand the structure of Hussein's critique and see exactly how he uses various reports to build his narrative. To navigate all this information, we're going to follow a four-part evidence map. First up, individual accounts of abuse. Second, institutional human rights reports. Third, systemic and legal mechanisms. And fourth, the geopolitical response. But before we get into the real specifics, let's establish the context. Hussain anchors his whole argument across a very specific timeline. He notes a massive spike in arbitrary arrests starting in October 2023, moving into 2024 when the ICC issued those major arrest warrants. Then there's a highly detailed UN report in March 2025, and all of this culminates in May 2026 with the publication of the Dawn op-ed we're unpacking right now.
All right, part one, individual accounts of abuse.
The op-ed actually kicks off its argument not with high-level politics, but with the human element. The author heavily relies on a piece by New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof to emphasize that the alleged abuse involves a really wide range of perpetrators. He's arguing that this isn't just isolated to a single rogue group. Instead, the reports allege involvement from soldiers, settlers, interrogators in the Shin Bet Internal Security Agency, and, above all, prison guards. Now, what's really interesting about how the author builds this argument is his focus on specific cases, like a 46-year-old freelance journalist named Sami Al-Sai. Detained in 2024, Al-Sai linked his alleged abuse directly to pressure from Israeli authorities who were trying to force him to become an informer. It's a specific, tangible example the author uses to illustrate the broader, coercive pressures that detainees reportedly face while in custody. But the op-ed asks a completely valid critical question. If this is happening, why don't we hear more of these specific stories directly from survivors? Well, Hussain points out that many simply stay silent for a few key reasons. First, there's the very real fear of targeted security reprisals against their families. Second, within Arab society, he notes, there's a hesitation to discuss these topics because it might hurt the morale of prisoners' families or even undermine the narrative of the defiant detainee. And finally, conservative norms play a massive role. Survivors worry that speaking out could literally ruin the matrimonial prospects of their relatives.
Moving on to part two, institutional human rights reports.
Zooming out to the international level, the op-ed draws heavily on a pretty stark UN report from March 2025, and the language here is intense. It describes sexual and gender-based violence not as anomalies, but as standard operating procedures employed as a tool of war to humiliate and intimidate. The author uses this exact phrasing to build his core argument, that these alleged abuses represent systemic, deeply ingrained practices documented by the United Nations. He also breaks down some really dense findings from the Geneva-based Euromed Human Rights Monitor, spanning late 2023 to late 2025. Hussain highlights sweeping arbitrary arrests, but crucially, he points out that visits by the Red Cross and lawyers were allegedly blocked entirely. Because of that blockade, the report had to rely heavily on testimonies from released detainees. And the author's quick to note that these testimonies are further corroborated by rare Israeli whistleblowers, including doctors and soldiers, who have admitted to medical violations. Let's move to part three and see how this builds into systemic and legal mechanisms. Having presented both individual and institutional reports, Hussain now analyzes the legal framework that he argues enables these alleged abuses in the first place. He points to this concept of legal black holes. Drawing on that Euromed report we just talked about, he describes a complex system that activates the unlawful combatants law. Basically, this is used to drastically broaden detention powers while completely bypassing any kind of judicial oversight. Within this system, the Euromed findings point to what they flat-out categorize as war crimes, specifically noting deliberate medical neglect. The op-ed underscores the sheer severity of the conditions by describing intense psychological trauma. In fact, it notes that victims often suffer severe psychological breakdowns just trying to recount these events during their testimonies. It is a visceral, deeply unsettling look at the lasting impact of the systemic framework. To back up his argument, Hussain brings in recent legislative developments, specifically critiquing a 2026 parliamentary bill. This bill actually mandates military courts in the occupied West Bank to issue death sentences for what are termed terror acts. The author argues this move is highly discriminatory and completely contravenes international law, presenting it as further evidence of a deeply problematic legal apparatus that is trying to legislate for territories outside its own borders. Which brings us to our final section, the geopolitical response. Shifting to the global stage, the author draws a really sharp contrast regarding the international fallout. And this brilliantly illustrates his point. On one side, you have the 2024 International Criminal Court actions, literally issuing arrest warrants for top Israeli officials accused of war crimes. But then, Hussain juxtaposes this with the global reality. He argues that despite these severe legal actions, the reality on the ground is one of total inaction, reflecting the complicity of Western and Arab nations in creating this pervasive sense of impunity. The author brings this critique close to home, too. He asserts that it is deeply ironic that many Arab nations, along with Pakistan, are currently engaging with a U.S.-led Board of Peace, specifically mentioning Donald Trump's involvement, aimed at the rehabilitation of Gaza. Hussain's op-ed argues that engaging in these diplomatic efforts, while the severe human rights allegations we've just mapped out remain totally unaddressed, is fundamentally contradictory. So what does this all mean? Well, Hussain leaves us with an incredibly provocative closing thought. He posits that if all these reports from the New York Times, the United Nations, and various global human rights groups detail only a fraction of the alleged crimes, it leaves us with a critical question. If this mountain of documentation isn't enough, what will it actually take to galvanize the international community into meaningful action? It is a stark, lingering disconnect between international reporting and global action that the author leaves us to ponder. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer to methodically map out the structure and claims of this complex op-ed.